Presented by Caltech.
So, welcome everybody. Though I might not look like it, I am actually Paul Wenberg today. I'm sure many of you know Paul, and he sends his regrets for not being here. I am the stand-in for Paul as director of the Linde Center to just welcome you here this morning and also to thank you for coming. Paul is on sabbatical in Copenhagen, and I'm sure he would have been standing right here if he wasn't pulled away by that important aspect of academia. The Linde Center is housed in a building right next door to here. I hope during your time here you get a chance to come and see the building that Ron and Maxine generously helped us renovate here on campus. It's a LEED Platinum building full of the analytical labs that do the environment and climate work that we do here at Caltech, including Paul's labs, including my labs, including Christian's, where Eric was a postdoc. He's sitting with my group. I think he was dismayed by that in his offices. But please come over and visit us. There's several very cool things about the building, including that it's a working celiostat, so you can see a live image of the sun, count sunspots just like Galileo if you'd like. It's kind of a cool spot. The second thing is I'd like to say that this is our third one of these workshops. The first two, one on the Southern Ocean and one on monsoons, were very fun, and I think we got a lot of positive feedback about it. These workshops are something we're trying to do through the Linde Center about once a year, plus or minus, 12 months, something like that. And when we feel like there's a really interesting hot topic that we should devote some of the resources of the Linde Center towards, it's very fun to bring a group like you guys in and get started on that. So thank you for coming. This is something that we partner for the facility with the KISS Center, so the Keck Institute for Space Studies that Michelle started out as the Associate Director, Operations Director of, and you've already heard from Michelle already this morning. She's done a lot of the work to put this conference together, and so I'm sure we'll get a chance many times over the course of the week, but please thank her. You'll see that she'll become a big part of your life for the next few days. But you're going to head over after the morning session. I think lunch starts over there with these workshops at the KISS Center, and then that'll be your home for the next several days. Except for the return here on Wednesday afternoon, we'll have our regular Environmental Science and Engineering Wednesday seminar series. Daniel Jacob will be the speaker as part of this workshop. So you will be coming back over to this part of campus at least once more. And so finally, in thanks to both Michelle and also the Linde Center staff, Nora and Kathy, I'd like to welcome you all here. I think Christian or Eric is going to just say one or two things quickly about today's program, and hope to see you around campus. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you, Jess. I'll be very brief. First, I just want to reiterate the thank you to the Linde Center and to KISS for making this possible. Christian and I have been kind of batting around this idea of having this workshop for a couple years now, and so we're really excited to be able to do this. As Jess indicated, we really think it's a very exciting time right now for methane. There's a lot of interesting questions and seemingly contradictory results in the scientific literature, but also that make their way into the media, and hopefully we can really dive into that today. We're very thankful that everyone has been able to join us, and kind of without further ado, this morning's session, we're going to be led off by Lori Bruhwiler from NOAA, and Lori's done a lot of work with methane, considering network observations from the ground and inverse modeling to understand that, so she'll really introduce us to this problem that way. She'll be followed up by Patrick Krill, who will really dive into some of the details of wetlands and some of their roles in the system. Hopefully you find this really informative, and we'll build from there. And without that, Lori, please take it away.
Well, good morning. Okay, the mic is on. I'm really pleased to be here for this workshop. I've been looking forward to this. I think it's going to be a great week. And I'm going to start off by sort of giving us an overview of the methane problem. And just so that some of you maybe will know everything I'm going to say, I'll try to keep it entertaining by spicing it up with my own personal insights and opinions. So this is, for those of you who haven't been there, this is where I work. This is NOAA Environmental Research Laboratories in Boulder. Actually, Earth System Research Laboratory. This is a beautiful winter day, and I would like to start out by talking about why we even care about methane, and that requires me to show this plot. This is an information product that we produce in my lab, and it tells you basically what the radiative forcing is as a function of time. And they formulated this thing called the annual greenhouse gas index, and it's supposed to tell us how much the radiative forcing has changed since 1990, which is sort of a baseline year. This is entirely based on observations taken at our lab. So it's really an observationally based quantity, and of course you have to calculate the radiative transfer to get this result. But what this really tells you pretty much right away is that CO2 is really the big player in terms of anthropogenic radiative forcing. But methane comes in second place, followed by assorted other gases such as nitrous oxide, which is actually, in my opinion, the second most interesting greenhouse gas to methane, of course, and the CFCs. So this is why we care about methane. It makes up a big chunk of the anthropogenic radiative forcing. Unlike CO2, I mean, there's a big difference between methane and CO2, and I want to show you these two figures. I'm going to talk more about global average quantities later. But what I want to draw your attention to here is the difference in these two time series that you get for methane and CO2. You see that CO2 is just rising and rising and rising as we fill the atmosphere with fossil fuel emissions. Methane, on the other hand, shows a very different behavior over time. It rises steeply for a while, and then it appears to level off. And I've covered up the really juicy recent stuff. Don't worry, we'll get to that later. But you can see that, with methane, you have this potential to reach some sort of steady state. Why is this? Because it has a loss. If you were to write the differential equation describing the state of methane, you would see that it's emissions minus sinks. The emissions in the sinks are approximately in balance. You can reach a steady state for that reason. So this is a big difference between methane and CO2. Another difference, of course, is that CO2 is present in much higher abundance in the atmosphere than is methane. So one of the really interesting things about methane is that nearly everything we humans do has something to do with methane. So from the way we produce our food, and here I'm showing you cows, and potentially these cows are burping into their feed. Burping is thought to be the main process by which methane comes from these animals into the atmosphere. It comes out the front, not necessarily the back, although probably comes out the back too. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of what do you do with their manure? That can generate methane as well, depending on how you take care of that. Then there's rice paddies, and you can get methane emissions in these kind of human-caused wetlands, and methane can be transported through the stems of grass and get into the atmosphere that way. So the way we produce our food, the way, obviously, we produce our energy, and coal emits methane. Largely, it's underground mines that are vented to the atmosphere that are doing this. Because near the surface, you've already lost a lot of the methane to the atmosphere over the eons. So really, it's underground mines. This is a picture of an open pit mine. Oil and gas. And then, of course, what we do with our waste when we're done using it. So garbage, landfills emit methane, and wastewater treatment plants. So we humans can do a lot to change the methane budget, and we have. As this next slide shows, this is data from the Vostok ice core in Antarctica. It goes back hundreds of thousands of years. And I think what you can tell from this is, well, obviously methane and temperature are correlated, but what you can see is that before people were around, methane was pretty low in the atmosphere. It was, around 500 ppb. Up here, you can see what happened in the recent millennia. People showed up and started doing the things that I showed in the previous slide, and methane steeply rose, where now it's up around 1750, 18. So we have really drastically perturbed the natural abundance of methane in the atmosphere. Interestingly, and this could be a whole nother talk in itself, is that some people have speculated that even going back to 1,000 1,000 years ago, people were starting to mess around with the methane budget, and that perhaps we raised the abundance even back this far. There's some papers by Ruddiman et al. That are very intriguing. Now, what people are doing is not the entire story, because methane also has lots of very interesting natural emission processes, such as fires. And this picture here shows some gas hydrates down on the bottom of the ocean. You can see they're bubbling. Big question, how much of the methane in these bubbles actually makes it to the surface? You got mud volcanoes and wetlands, even bugs. And this is a termite mound. So termites have the same kind of same kind of microbes in their guts when they're digesting the cellulose that leads to methane emissions. But it's not just termites. Roaches can also emit methane. So I think that's kind of interesting. Here's a case where you have a drilling pad in the West Siberian lowlands superimposed on this area of a lot of boreal wetlands. So here you have a 2-for-1. You've got a human source and a natural source. And the point is that some of these natural sources may be extremely sensitive to changing climate conditions. So for example, most of you have probably heard about the potential for a climate carbon feedback in the form of thawing permafrost carbon. And there is some evidence that maybe this has happened in the past. So 55 million years ago, you had some events where the Earth's atmosphere appeared to warm very quickly over a short period of time, 5 degrees over a few thousand years. That's pretty rapid. And some paleoclimate studies have shown that back in the Eocene, you had more permafrost than we have today. We think today there's about 1,700 petagrams buried in Arctic soils, but back then you had the potential for having permafrost in Antarctic as well. So there was a study by DeCanto et al. It was a modeling study combined with a paleoclimate data study that suggested that thawing permafrost could have released carbon into the atmosphere, and it could have caused these big temperature spikes that we see in the paleo records. Now, not all of this carbon would have been methane, and some estimates show that maybe up to 3% would be. Now that matters because, as I showed earlier on one of my slides, but forgot to mention, methane has a very high global warming potential. At least 28, depending on how you define it, 28. It's 28 times mass per mass more powerful than CO2. So it matters if some of that stuff was methane. Not only that, but some of these natural emission processes can be very sensitive to interannual variability in climate. So for example, one of the big modes of variability in climate that we know of is El Nino. And during the El Nino, or the warm phase of the cycle, one often sees very dry conditions in the tropics. Just check out Southeast Asia here, very dry. And when that happens, the thinking is that the wetlands maybe are reduced in area, maybe some of them dry out, maybe there's fires. On the other hand, during the opposite phase, during the cool phase, the La Nina, one can see potentially very wet conditions in the tropics. And this would be expected naively, maybe Patrick will be correcting me on this later, but you would expect this to lead to higher methane emissions. So, how well do we know the methane budget? I just picked out what I think is a pretty appealing picture of the methane budget. I got it from this website, The Carbon Brief. And here you see that sinks, like I said earlier, approximately balanced sources, not exactly, but approximately. And that natural sources, at least in this version of the budget, slightly exceed anthropogenic sources. Now, not all budgets are divided up this way. In fact, we don't really know very well how to divide this into these different components. You can see that this particular budget even makes rooms for hydrates and permafrost, which are two things that we know very little about what the net methane emissions might be at the current time. I guess one of the reasons why I really like this picture is because they include beavers. And beavers, of course, make wetlands, and there have also been some studies that suggest that when people stop using beavers to make hats and coats, that wetland areas increase, and this had an effect on the methane budget. So I guess that would be an indirect anthropogenic / natural kind of process feedback. So this is what I mean about methane, though. There are very many interesting things to think about when it comes to methane. So we're not, as I said, very good at figuring out what the sources of methane are. And just to prove this, I want to show you what happens if you take our atmospheric observations, you use them to calculate a global average, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and then you figure out what the emissions are. So you can do this because we measure the abundance of methane in the atmosphere. We know how it changes over time. In fact, we know these things very accurately, as I'll get to in a minute. And if you know these two things, you can, and you make some assumption about the lifetime of methane, which we usually get using this other species, methylchloroform, which we think we have a good handle on its emissions, and we know it's only destroyed by OH, or as far as we know, that's the case. If you do that, you can get an estimate for the amount of OH, which is the big chemical sink of methane, and you can calculate the total emissions. So my colleague Ed Dlugokenski did that here, and that's what you see these blue dots are. On the other hand, if you take one of our databases that tries to estimate anthropogenic emissions, and you take some estimate for our natural emissions, you see here that you significantly overpredict what we think we observed in the atmosphere. So obviously there's a lot of room to make progress here trying to figure out what methane emissions are. Christian pointed me to these two interesting figures which appeared in the recent IPCC report. And these figures here, well, they show you what we saw in the atmosphere for both CO2 here and methane here. But they also are showing you what we thought would happen from the different assessments that have happened. So the first one, the second one, third one, AR4, different scenarios. They started to get more complicated in AR4. Anyways, you can see that there's quite a range of projections according to these various versions of the reports. But for CO2, we appear to be on track to meet one of the potentially most dire scenarios considered by the AR4. On the other hand, for methane, the situation is very different. You can see that methane rose steeply, it leveled off, and there was a big range in the projections. We didn't hit any of them, but happily, we're below what some of these assessments thought we would be. So I suppose that's good news for now, but who knows what will happen next? Maybe we'll take off steeply and end up in one of these bad places again. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about, give you an overview of how we know what methane is in the atmosphere and how it's changing over time. And I want to start out with a little bit of history here. I want to talk about atmospheric monitoring. Now, it was Ralph Keeling at Scripps that I think we should give credit for coming up with this idea that we should gather long time series of observations in remote places in order to understand the background behavior of something like CO2. Methane came along a little bit later. In 1978, the Roland Blake group at UC Irvine started to measure methane at remote sites distributed over the Pacific. So they have 45 remote sites. They still are doing this. They measure about 4 times per year, and they measure many other hydrocarbons and halocarbons as well. So this is really the longest network time series of observations. NOAA began their network in 1983, and that continues to today. There are 60 sites. You can't really say that all of them are remote background atmospheric sites. We try to collect samples at least weekly. At some sites it's more frequent, some sites less. Sometimes sites get shut down and so on, so that network isn't exactly constant over time. We also measure a suite of other radiatively active gases, as I showed you in the picture of the greenhouse gas index, or the atmospheric greenhouse gas index, the AGGI. We use these things to calculate the radiative forcing and how it's changed since 1990. And then, of course, we have the A-gauge network, which I forgot to check how many gases they measure. So that's pretty funny. And then they have dozens of globally distributed sites. Now, I'm afraid this slide kind of gives the short end of the stick to some of our other colleagues. CSIRO has been measuring at Cape Grim since 1984. We have ALERT since '88. There are many institutions that also operate long-running sites, but these are the first kind of extensive networks, so I thought I would sort of give you an idea of characteristics of those networks. Now, an important issue that comes up with these network observations is calibration. And this is our calibration lab, and I like this picture because you can see there's stuff steaming here. But actually, this is a CO2 calibration lab, not the methane calibration lab. I couldn't find a picture of that. It turns out that NOAA maintains the WMO standards for CO2, methane, and some other important greenhouse gases. And this is quite an operation that they do. It requires, first of all, calibration itself, when my colleagues discuss it, regard it as a way to accurately measure a known concentration. So you have a standard, you know what's in that standard. You repeatedly measure that standard over time to make sure things aren't drifting. That is what they refer to as calibration. Now, for a remote sensing instrument, calibration is probably a different thing. It means do you measure the expected radiance? But here we're talking about reproducing known concentrations. You don't want standards drifting over time. You want to make sure you span the range of possible values. And so because ice core measurements are done, we need standards for ice age values, which were around 500 ppb, up to modern polluted values, which can be several ppm. So you need a range of tanks to do this. Right now, when we calculate, say, a global average, we believe that our, well, for a particular sample, we believe that they are accurate by about 1.1 ppb at a 95% confidence level. Earlier in the history of the network, the uncertainties were a little bit higher. So this is very precise. I mean, this is 0.06% of the global concentration, which is up around 1850, or 0.5% of global emissions. So theoretically, we could see a difference out of 550 net emissions per year. We could see maybe a change of 3 teragrams, theoretically. If we could understand where that 3 teragram change came from, that is a different question. Why do we need to have these careful calibrations? Well, as I said, the global average is around 1850, north-south gradient 150, so that's okay. That should be pretty easy to observe. Gradients between the Pacific and Atlantic basins, those might be 10 ppb. So if you want to do a mass balance across continents, you might, now you're starting to need quite a lot of accuracy or precision. Seasonal cycle, a few tens of ppb. Trends, I mean, the changes in global atmospheric methane have ranged from, negative or a ppb per year to more recently tens of ppb per year. So we need, if we're going to have a network, we need to have all of those observations comparable, and we need to have them calibrated. And this is quite an enterprise. So how does NOAA do the sampling? Basically, we have volunteers at sites distributed throughout the world. The volunteers take this device here, which is, looks like a suitcase. This black thing here is a fishing pole. You raise that thing up. It's connected to some tubing. It fills this glass bottle, which is wrapped in masking tape, I guess, for safety. And here's a bunch of bottles. Then the flask is removed from this device and mailed in boxes back to the lab in NOAA, where just across from my office, the samples are analyzed. So an advantage of this is that you're always using the same analysis system to measure air from all over the world. But it is a logistical undertaking, keeping track of all these flasks and shipping them back and forth. We also have baseline observatories, and right now there are 6 of them. And the idea here is that you can sample, you can install analyzers at these observatories and sample at high frequency. And in the next slide, I'll show you why we might want to do that. But for now, I'll tell you, right now we have 6 observatories. This is probably our most famous one, Mauna Loa. And then, of course, we have the South Pole. A couple of these observatories, we're probably going to be scaling back our activities due to budget concerns. But these observatories have been some of them have been operating since the early 1980s. So why would we want to collect high-frequency data? Well, this is an example. This is Barrow, Alaska, and the blue line is what happens if you sample from what they call the clean air sector, which is coming off the Arctic Ocean. You can see you get a very nice seasonal cycle here with a minimum in the summer, maximum in the winter. However, if you look at the non-clean air sector, which may contain air that has passed over nearby wetlands, you get very different behavior. Here, late in the growing season, you tend to get a lot of excursions from the background air, and this is probably signals from nearby wetlands. If you go ahead and calculate the seasonal cycle here, you can see the background seasonal cycle and the seasonal cycle from the non-clean air sector look very different. And in particular, this one seems to contain a lot more information about local terrestrial sources than this one, which would reflect the well-mixed background atmosphere. So high-frequency observations can be very helpful for helping us to understand some of the processes that occur in different parts of the ecosystem. A little bit more recently, there was an interest in understanding continental budgets. Part of this was motivated by Peter Tons's 1990 paper, which found a large carbon uptake in the northern hemisphere biosphere. And that sort of pushed people to try to understand what's going on in continental regions as well. And of course, nowadays, we're very interested in being able to quantify anthropogenic emissions from continental regions as well. So NOAA started up two sort of North American-focused monitoring efforts. One is the aircraft program, which is overseen by Colm Sweeney, who's here at this meeting. And the other is an effort to outfit some of these tall communications towers with, okay, good, everything's cool, with instruments. And this enables one to get profile information. So this can also be potentially useful for quantifying sources and sinks. Now I'm going to shift focus a little bit and talk about what we're all here to discuss and argue about this week, which is what the heck is going on with global methane. So over here I'm showing you our global average methane abundance, which, as I've explained, we know this really well from our in situ surface network. And there's three real kind of phases of behavior here. First, there's this period of rapid growth. Then there's this pause in growth, followed by renewed growth. So I'm going to talk about these three distinct regimes here, but not in detail because I think speakers after me will be discussing this. Now, as far as the rapid growth and the pause, Ed Dlugokenski wrote a few papers, 1998 and 2003, which proposed that this behavior happens because there was an approach to steady state, meaning sources and sinks became approximately in balance. In his first paper, he said that we would reach maybe 1780 ppb by the 2010s. So we're about there, actually. In his 2003 paper, he suggested that, well, methane wasn't really going to reach this level. It actually leveled off earlier to about 1750. So one way to understand this part of the curve then is to say, well, sources and sinks became in about equilibrium and methane leveled off in the atmosphere. However, there were other ideas. It was proposed that decreases in leaks from fossil fuel production since the 1980s caused this leveling off. This was proposed by Aiden and Simpson. I believe the Aiden study used some ice core data in addition to the atmospheric observations. Simpson, both of them used ethane, which is co-emitted when you produce oil and gas with methane. Then someone else looked at the microbial side of things and said, no, there's reductions in rice emissions. People found better ways to do rice agriculture. Maybe they were draining the rice fields during the non-growing seasons and so forth. And then Matt Rigby proposed that it was OH increased. So if you increase OH, you're going to increase the rate at which methane is removed from the atmosphere. So Rigby explains it with an increase in OH. Actually, he had an early paper that proposed this, and now he's got a more recent one out that kind of says something very similar. But one thing I want to point out here, though, is that according to the steady state hypothesis, you don't actually need to have reductions in emissions to get the shape of curve. You only need for the sources and sinks to become about equal. So it's not necessary to have decreases in emissions to get that kind of behavior. So now what about the renewed growth? So this is pretty interesting. There have been several nice papers suggesting that microbial emissions are changing over time. Schaefer went a little bit further and said, well, it's probably anthropogenic microbial, meaning cows and rice and waste, rather than natural wetlands. Sanois picked up on this theme and said, well, the models of wetlands are saying that wetland areas have been pretty stable or even decreased, so that kind of bolsters this idea that it's anthropogenic microbial. And then, of course, there were also some papers suggesting fossil fuels. There was the Rice et al. Paper that said global fossil fuel emissions have been growing. The Turner study that suggested that US emissions could account for 40% of the increase. I think I'm remembering that number right. And then Matt Rigby proposed again that OH has now decreased, meaning that the sink is smaller, meaning that methane could go up in the atmosphere. So we have OH going up and down, and the size of the trends, interestingly, in Rigby's paper are like 10% decadal trends. That is a very interesting thing, because previously most of us have assumed that OH is pretty stable. So that's probably going to be a big topic of discussion later on this week. And then Turner pointed out also that it could be OH, and he doubts that isotopes provide a useful constraint on the global budget. So let's talk a little bit more about what pieces of evidence we have to help us figure out what causes the global growth rate and how to assign that to different source processes. So we have isotopic methane, so C13 of CH4. We know that the signal from microbial processes is such that you get a lighter, the air emitted from microbial processes is lighter because the organisms like to use the lighter isotope. We have methylchloroform, which we use, as I mentioned earlier, to get OH. And we have ethane, which is co-emitted with methane when we produce oil and gas. So it's possible that observations of these things can help us to constrain parts of the methane budget. However, use of each of these things has associated with it uncertainties, and there are many things we don't know, for example, about how much ethane is produced compared to methane and how that varies over temporal and spatial scales. So using these other things as diagnostics also introduces some uncertainty. Recently, there was Owen Sherwood collected a massive, what I think is a massive amount of isotopic signature data and compiled that and provided us with probably our most extensive glimpse at characterizing isotopic source signatures from a variety of processes. And what I'm showing you here is only the fossil fuel part, but what I want to point out is that here we have, this is the ratio of C1 to C2 and C3. You should consider this an indication of how dry the gas is. That means whether there's oil in it or whether there's these higher hydrocarbons in it. So the higher the value is, the drier the gas is. Then, of course, we have the isotopes of methane down here in parts per mil. And you can see, even for these three fossil fuel processes, you can have quite a variable isotopic source signature coming from these things. So if you have pretty young gas that is, it's going to look very microbial. On the other hand, this old stuff that's been cooked for a really long time, that's going to have a heavier isotopic signature, making it look more like, say, biomass burning. But the important point here is that most of the leakage occurs in this area. You really have to weight this by the amount produced. Very little of the global leakage is really thought to come from these really light and really heavy signatures. So that's what Stefan Schweizke did. He took this database of isotopic source signatures, he weighted them by how much methane it gets into the atmosphere, and he found that he got a possible revision in the global methane budget. So instead of having a source signature from fossil fuel emissions of, say, minus 40 parts per mil, Stefan's revised global average source signature is now minus 44 parts per mil. And what that does is it actually repartitions between microbial and thermogenic sources, so that before you maybe got very much smaller emissions from global fossil fuels, but now it's been adjusted upwards pretty significantly based on this isotopic data set. Likewise, microbial emissions have been shifted downwards, but he still finds that microbial emissions have to go up to explain the recent trends in atmospheric isotopic methane. So that's a little bit a bit on isotopes. But in addition to measuring species that are related in some way to the methane budget, we also have something else we can work with, and that something else is the spatial distribution of methane. So this is the north-south distribution from the surface network here. You can see that it's high at the high latitudes and low at the low latitudes. And this provides us information about the distribution of sources and sinks. This implies that you have more sources in the northern hemisphere than in the southern hemisphere, for example. This figure here is something that my colleague Ed Długo-Kensky likes to show a lot. It is the distribution of the growth rate. And here you can see that sometimes you'll have a place where something appears to be going on, methane appears to be growing faster than usual. This sort of makes one think that there's some change in a source located in these latitudes. This is zonally averaged, by the way. So the spatial distribution is another constraint on the methane budget. It tells us where things may be changing, and if you know approximately where wetlands are, for example, or oil and gas production, you can use that information, hopefully, to say something about how sources are changing over time. Now, the fact that you get high values of methane in the high latitudes, I mean, this whole distribution here arises out of, it's a balance between emissions, chemical destruction, and transport. That's what maintains this gradient here. Now, just because you have, in the wintertime, and even in the summertime too, you have the highest abundance of methane at high latitudes, this does not mean that this is where the strongest sources are, as has been proposed by some people. In fact, because if you take a model, and models allow us to do crazy experiments that don't happen in nature, if you take a model and you force it with repeating emissions, and you calculate the gradient between Barrow and Mauna Loa, you get a considerable gradient, over 50 ppb, and a lot of variability. On the other hand, with a model, you can turn the emissions off north of 60 degrees. So this is like saying to the model, I don't want there to be any Arctic emissions. Then ask yourself, what does the gradient look like? You still get a gradient, even without any sources in the Arctic. You still get a gradient, and you still get a lot of variability. And this variability is coming from transport of source signals at lower latitudes. So if you want to find, say, a signal due to changing Arctic emissions, you can see already you're working with a pretty noisy system. You're going to have to look for a long time. And on that theme, I want to talk just a little bit about oil and gas, because recently there has been a dialogue in this country about trying to control emissions of methane from natural gas. And it turned out that when people from NOAA and elsewhere started going to these basins and trying to figure out how much methane was coming out of these basins, they learned that there was probably more coming out than could be accounted for in inventories of emissions, say from the EPA. So what they learned basically was that there's equipment out there that leaks that we didn't know about, and that there's processes that people are doing to, as part of hydrofracturing or whatever, there's processes that result in more emissions than we knew about. And over time, what has happened is that the EPA inventories, for example, have increased over time in response to what we've learned in field studies. But these field studies are looking at discrete basins. What if you want to quantify emissions over the whole US? Well, what do we currently have at our disposal in terms of the in situ network? We have aircraft profiles. Some of these profiles are on the western side of the country, some are on the east, some in the middle. Can we use that kind of information to quantify trends? So, it depends on how long you want to wait to get your information. So what we did here, these are all model calculations. There is data in here, the green point, but I'll get to that in a minute. But we had a control case with constant oil and gas emissions, and then we had a case where we put a significant perturbation on US oil and gas emissions. We gave them a big trend, and we wanted to know how long would it take for us to be able to detect that trend if we used the difference between the planetary boundary layer and the free troposphere as an indicator. So we want to see, if emissions are changing, methane is going to build up in the planetary boundary layer, and we're going to see a steeper gradient over time. So if you want to know within 4 years, and remember IPCC is asking us to report every 5 years, if you want to know in 4 years, well, you're going to have a hard time. You're going to have to sample extremely frequently, like less than every 5 days. And the reason I'm saying this is because you want to look for where the error bars on these trends don't overlap anymore. And these error bars, we used a Monte Carlo process here to figure out the trends and their uncertainties. So you want to be able to tell these two cases apart is the basic criteria here. If you allow yourself 6 years, you can get away with sampling much less frequently, maybe once a week. 8 years, you can really do a much better job if you're going to, I forgot to mention, sampling interval is what's on the bottom axis, and the green points is where we are right now. At this site, HIL, which I believe is Homer, Illinois, we sample about once every 3 weeks. And so you can see here that it's only when you get out to 8 years that you could pick up a trend like this. And let me also point out that this is a very large trend. The bottom-up studies and inventory suggest that the real trend, if it's out there, that one might expect due to increasing production in this country is likely to be 5 to 10 times less than this. This is an incredibly large trend. Well, another thing, and this is pretty obvious, measuring things near to the source helps you out. So these two sites here on the left, Southern Great Plains and Carr, Colorado, they're near oil and gas producing regions. So you see a signal much quicker, and you could get away with less frequent sampling. But if you're going to wait till you get to the East Coast, here at Cape May, New Jersey, or New Hampshire, it's going to be very hard to pick out even a large trend like this. So this is a statement about what we need to do to monitor changing emissions from, say, oil and gas production. Obviously, we need a dense network with frequent sampling. And one has to ask oneself whether that's ever going to happen using in situ techniques. This is a strong argument for space-based measurement techniques because we will get the high-frequency sampling and we will get the dense data points as well. Okay, so one thing I've already mentioned is that we need long time series to detect small trends. So for example, in the Arctic, we might want to pick up a very small change in wetland emissions that's happening over multiple decades. We have to look for a long time because the atmosphere is very variable. Well, there's two problems that we confront when we're doing this. One is that we don't have that many sites. I mean, there's vast swaths of Eurasia that are not sampled. But another thing, and this is why I wanted to show this slide, is that we have very few sites with very long time series. We have some that were supposedly going to be long time series until they got cut off. So I think, in cases where we want to monitor changes, we want to know that something is changing in the terrestrial ecosystem as early as possible, we need to maintain these long-term networks. At these high latitudes, with current space-based observing systems, we're not going to see these latitudes very well at all. We need long time series. We need to make a commitment to monitor up there. And as I said, even for the anthropogenic emissions at lower latitudes, the same thing exists. We need dense sampling, and we need to make a commitment to monitor things over a long period of time. So I want to just end. I have a few minutes left. I just want to end by saying that modeling can also help us. And by modeling, I mean assimilation techniques. Because how do we get from this information that we measure in the atmosphere to something like this, which is a source map? Well, we have to incorporate our understanding of atmospheric transport to untangle what this means in terms of what happened at the surface. So to do that, we use atmospheric flux inversions. I'm sure we'll be talking more about this later on this week as well, but the basic idea is you take the best data you have available to constrain your system. You take some kind of first guess of emissions. Usually these come from inventories. You use an atmospheric transport model to simulate these things at your network sites. You get a mismatch. Then you use an optimization to correct your atmospheric state, which may include the full 3D fields and the emissions. And you get an updated emission estimate, which now optimally agrees with your network observations. So when we're doing this, of course, there are two key issues that we have to confront. First of all, the data density issue still exists. It's possible that the space-based observations will solve this problem for us. But in terms of the in situ network, we just don't have that many sites. And this map I took from the World Data Center for Greenhouse Gases at JMA. And the red points are contributions that have been recently updated within the last year. The blue are sites where the investigators there have not updated their data so that it can be shared with everyone. So that's one problem. Can we come to a point where we can figure out how to share data in a timely manner so that we can reproduce each other's results? Because suppose you have a network where people don't want to share the data and then they come up with conclusions about their fluxes. How can we reproduce that? One of the basic fundamental things about science is reproducibility of results. Secondly, we need to improve our modeling skills. Right now we're missing a lot of variability when we try to characterize things in terms of a grid box of this size. If we want to learn from our continental observations, we have to be able to simulate those observations. Sure, simulating these remote ocean sites, that's easy. We can do it even with our fairly coarse resolution results. But if all we do is make use of the background data, then we're going to learn about the north-south gradient and the global budget, but we will not be able to learn about what's going on in these various continental regions until we can simulate those. So that brings me to my conclusions. It's kind of hard to make really great conclusions on an overview talk like this, but I guess if I want you to remember a few things, I probably don't even need you to remember this, because this is what we're all here to discuss and argue about, is what's happening with the recent growth. I think most of you will probably agree that we need to make a commitment to monitoring the atmosphere over the long haul in order to understand potential carbon-climate feedbacks and in order to make policy decisions. And we need to improve our modeling ability. And I will stop there. Thank you.